I feel you. I'm not sick, but I woke up not wanting to come here because I just felt so dry.
You're not going to school today?
No, I have the empty class today.
Oh yeah, it's Tuesday. I keep thinking it's Monday.
We might actually be cooked. No, we might actually be cooked.
Hopefully I can stay awake.
Okay, so
Quiz 7 is just on chapter 11. Okay, that's fine. That's good.
What's November? What's November?
So, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Just wanted to remind you of the schedule. So today is Tuesday. A week from today, we have a quiz. The following week, we have an exam. Okay, this material is definitely the most difficult out of any of the three major topics: skeletal, muscular, and nervous tissue. The one thing that I have done for you is, and you guys owe me big, especially you. No, you guys owe me big for this, is that I've broken it up into two sections, the first section and the second section, rather than one big exam. That's what you do down on the main campus. So we have time enough to have a section right before Thanksgiving, an exam, and then then we'll be almost done with the semester after Thanksgiving. So the other thing is that this chapter that we're starting today that we started last week actually with the diagram and the vocabulary. This quiz will only be on one chapter, unlike previous quizzes. So this, and the final thing is that this is the 7th quiz of the semester, and there'll be one more after this. After that, I will take your lowest quiz grade out and group it as an exam. Take the average of the remaining top 7 quizzes, and make that an exam grade. So at the end of the day, this class will be graded on essentially 6 exams. 5 regular exams and then 1 grouped quiz exam. Okay, are there any questions about that? So we're almost done. About 5 more chapters to go. And let's get to it. So as you know, we're talking about the nervous system, and the first thing that we'll do is talk about nervous tissue. So there's 3 main topics in this class. There's skeletal system, and that's connective tissue. There's muscular tissue, and that's muscles. And then there's nervous tissue, and that's what this is. Unlike the other tissues, the nervous system is incredibly complex. It affects everywhere in the body, but it essentially is the director. It's the directorship of the body, and is basically it tells the body what to do. It doesn't actually do it. The vocabulary that I'll use today is largely built on or similar to what we talked about last week. So I'll start with the one big thing that students like to mix up is that a nerve and a neuron are not the same. A nerve, by definition, is part of the peripheral nervous system, and it is a series of largely axons that are wrapped successively in smaller and smaller groups. Those bundles of axons come in 2 varieties. There's either cranial nerves or spinal nerves, depending on where they originate. We will be talking about all of these cranial nerves and spinal nerves during the semester, so for the rest of the semester. The other thing that's different between these 2 types of this tissue is that the nervous tissue comes in 2 different types of cells, and those cells have very, very different jobs. In the first case, neurons only do one thing. They are very, very different than neuroglial or glial cells. The function of neurons is to only send action potentials. And we'll talk about the conditions under which that happens. We'll talk about how it happens and the factors that regulate whether or not it happens. So we'll talk about that. Before we get to all of those, the details of the action potentials, we'll talk more about the supporting cells. And those supporting cells are glial cells or neuroglial cells. You'll hear me use those 2 terms interchangeably. There are 6 types of those cells, 4 occurring in the central nervous system and 2 in the peripheral nervous system. You definitely need to understand those cells, and particularly when they start to go awry, when they start to malfunction, that can have chronic or chronic function, chronic consequences to disease. There's a couple examples of that in this lecture series. We talk about the vocabulary of this section is very big. And we'll start right here. The first is that when you're talking about not only are nerves different than neurons, there's also a term ganglion, and a ganglion is simply a group of cell bodies. And so if you don't remember what a cell body is, then we have to go back to what we talked about last week. A cell body is a collection of cell bodies that are outside of the brain, outside of the spinal cord, and they tend to be grouped in particular areas. There's one area directly adjacent to the spinal cord, also called the dorsal root ganglion, and that dorsal root ganglion is, and that name would indicate, right, it's a group of cell bodies, and you should be able to tell me where that is, what that does, and which direction the information is sending. And when I say which direction, the direction is either to the central nervous system or from the central nervous system. Once we're in the central nervous system, we don't know which direction it's sending signals. We know generally which, right? If the central nervous system is sending a signal in a motor direction, then it's sending it in an efferent direction. If it's sending it in it never sends it in an afferent direction. It receives afferent signals, but it does. But once we're talking about signals that are sent within the confines of the central nervous system, not in the peripheral nervous system, we won't talk about the direction of information. It's incredibly complex, and we'll talk a little bit about that. When you have extensive networks of axons that are located in particular areas, those are called plexuses or a plexus, and those tend to be groups of nerves and groups of axons in particular that are found in the same area. So you'll have the cervical plexus, the brachial plexus, etc. And just based on the second semester or the second quiz of the semester, you know that the brachial area is the area associated with the arm, and the cervical area is associated with the cervical vertebrae. So there are 2 plexuses right in that area that serve particularly important parts of the body. So that term plexus is another vocabulary term. When you're talking about the function of these of this whole system here, there's 3 main types of signals that are going to be sent, but the main function here is to maintain or to regulate homeostasis, and to maintain or regulate homeostasis, deal with insults or injuries, deal with infections, respond in either immediate or long-term fashion so that the body is able to maintain homeostasis. So once again, when we talk about homeostasis and whether it's positive feedback or negative feedback and things like that, that's all from the first exam. So there's that vocabulary too. I said a little, in the previous slide, that the direction of information will flow in 2 main directions. In the first direction, it's sensory input. Those sensory signals will be started by modified epithelial tissue. Those modified epithelial cells will synapse with dendrites of the sensory neurons, and those sensory neurons then send signals in an afferent direction to the central nervous system. The other opposite direction here is muscles that are synapsing, or not muscles, neurons that are synapsing with the central nervous system. They are motor neurons, and those are sending signals into 2 directions. There are 2 points of recipient. Those motor neurons either send signals to muscle cells or they send signals to glands. And they don't send signals anywhere else, and so it's relatively simple in that way. The third type of information, this integrating information, that is done by the brain and the spinal cord, and it causes you to either respond to stimuli or to ignore stimuli. One of the sort of classic examples of that is that if you've ever seen a young child that's super sensitive to fluorescent lights or other stimuli, external stimuli, and they just start sort of shaking and things like that, or start moving. And it's that external stimuli that causes them, that they're responding to, and then that external stimuli is making them nervous, making them active. It's often associated with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder. That hopefully is not what you're experiencing right now. Hopefully with these lights on and this, I'm not putting you to sleep. Hopefully you're paying attention to the words that I'm saying, and hopefully this information is received by your ears and your eyes, and it's getting into your sensory, into your integrating system, and you're going to respond to it. Hopefully putting it down somewhere, writing it, and then remembering it. That integrating system, you essentially, from sensory information, it has two choices. It can either respond to it, send a signal on to do something else, or ignore it. And that's all that the brain does. The brain does a whole bunch of time. It ignores a whole bunch of information. So these, underneath here where my pointer is, it says muscles and glands for the motor neurons here. Those glands, once again, they come in both exocrine and endocrine varieties. These higher level systems that is also associated with the nervous system are things that we'll get to in Unit 5 that's associated with the brain, but we're going to just touch very lightly on those. In other words, mental activity, consciousness, thinking, memory, emotions. Those things are really beyond the scope of this class, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to Unit 5. So if you had, in the previous 2 or 3 slides, an issue following with the vocabulary. Right? So I want to just illustrate, I'm trying to use a elevated vocabulary for this lesson or for this lecture, not because I want to show you how smart I am or anything like that, but I want to show you how detailed this vocabulary is. I'm just touching very lightly on this vocabulary, and it started, again, that list of vocabulary terms that I have in Brightspace. That list of vocabulary is what I'm using now, and it's going to continue today. So if you're having trouble following this, then make sure you go back to the vocabulary terms. There's like 70 vocabulary terms that, again, it was just sort of, it took me a number of years ago about 5 minutes to write down all those 70 vocabulary terms. In terms of the structure of the nervous system itself, there is 2 main varieties here, and that's what this table is talking about, sort of dividing the nervous system into 2 parts there, and then getting successively smaller and smaller groups. There are the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. In terms of the central nervous system, if you look there, there's only 2 parts of the brain and spinal cord. So we're going to spend much more time talking about the peripheral nervous system because it's much more, has much more variety. In particular, there's 2 directions of signals here. There are these 2 terms right here, sensory and afferent, mean the same thing. It means signals that are sending to the central nervous system. And then there's motor and efferent signals, and those motor and efferent signals, again, those are synonymous. They are signals that are sending from the central nervous system. Those motor or efferent signals come in 2 varieties. They either be somatic or autonomic. If it's somatic, it's not completely, but it's largely voluntary in nature. In other words, it's sending signals to your skeletal muscles, responding to stimuli, or saying, I want to pick up this pencil, so I pick up that pencil or pen. Right, so that's a voluntary stimulus that would be run a motor signal originating in the central nervous system, sent down through an afferent direction, sent to the somatic nervous system, and that's a voluntary. There's also a very complicated system, the involuntary system called autonomic system. That autonomic system has, so now this autonomic system, the way that this is described, is that this is just motor. But there's a whole other variety of sensory systems that are associated with this that have this feedback. So the body has a whole bunch of other stuff that is in the sensory subdivisions, right where my pointer is. And those it's called the enteric nervous system. That entire super huge amount of sensory neurons that send signals to the brain and say, this is happening here, this is happening there, what should we do? And then the brain sends signals to these either sympathetic or parasympathetic divisions. So the autonomic nervous system is only motor. It sends signals to the cardiac and muscle, smooth muscle, and and then to different glands. So that includes both exocrine and endocrine glands. We won't talk much more about this in this unit. We will in much greater detail in the next unit. But generally speaking, the sympathetic division does one thing and the parasympathetic division does the opposite. So the sympathetic division largely is called the fight or flight division, and the parasympathetic is the rest and digest. So these things operate in opposition to one another. They either increase the activity or decrease the activity of this organ or of this system. So the heart rate, the digestive system, the respiratory system, etc. It's not like we have the option of turning those systems off. If we do, that's a minor problem for our health. So the body doesn't do that. It either increases or decreases the rate. You can also have a conscious control. You could sit here and you could think about your heart rate. You could increase your heart rate there, and you could decrease your heart rate. So that would be mimicking what the autonomic nervous system, either the sympathetic or the parasympathetic division, is doing. If you ever heard of issues with complex autoimmune issues, autoimmune diseases, that is largely the sort of interactions with the autonomic nervous system. So here is a diagram that shows the central and peripheral nervous system, whether they're spinal cord and the brain, whether they're spinal nerves or cranial nerves. These cranial nerves, there's 12 that are all associated with largely, almost entirely with the face and the brain and the head, but not completely. There's some that go all the way down into the digestive system. There's some nerves, cranial nerves that go down to the nervous system, to the digestive system. Regardless of whether we're talking about cranial nerves or spinal nerves, this is part of the peripheral nervous system. And you can see terms that are associated with this, like I just used, the ganglion, for instance. More of the divisions here that sort of goes along with what I just talked about, whether it's sensory or motor, whether it's afferent or efferent, whether it's sympathetic or parasympathetic. These paired terms, you should know the opposites and what their functions are. And the key here is that the response is complete. It does complete the loop. In other words, the body does respond to stimuli, but the way that it responds is not in the same way. In other words, that the signal doesn't go back to its origination. So for instance, if you look here, the sensory, this person put their finger down on a tack, let's say, and they're going to respond to that, and this is called a reflex. And that reflex is an autonomic response. It's not thought about. And oftentimes it's taken, you're taking the brain entirely out of the reflex, the response. But that response here, the initial sensory input is the finger, and there's pain in the finger, and so those afferent neurons will send signals to the central nervous system, and then the central nervous system sends signals to the appropriate muscles to respond to it. So the muscles, now if the muscles that are responding end up pushing down on the finger, that's a problem, right? Why? Because that would increase the pain. So you don't want to push down on the pain. You want to elevate and move away from the pain. So your body can respond to that, and it's key to understand, it's important to understand that this is not, it doesn't go back to where the sensory system is sending signals from. Oftentimes it goes to a very, very different place. And here's a different view of this. Again, there's the afferent division. The afferent division, I've shown multiple diagrams so that you sort of just get different views of this. Whether it's when you're talking about the afferent division, there's the autonomic and the somatic nervous system. The one thing that I will say is that there's another way of classifying sensory systems there and motor systems. So one way is there's sensory receptors, There's visceral sensory receptors. Oh, I'm sorry, special sensory receptors. There's visceral sensory receptors, and somatic sensory receptors. Somatic sensory receptors generally, but not entirely, are voluntary in nature. So there's skeletal muscle, but there's also if you were to go to stand on one leg, your somatic nervous system and somatic sensory receptors would be responding to that different pressure on one leg as opposed to the other. The lack of pressure on one leg, the increased pressure on the other. Where are those receptors coming from? Largely from the joints and from skeletal muscles. They increase pressure on those skeletal muscles. So the somatic sensory receptors are largely associated with the peripheral nervous system, with the somatic nervous system, but they're not entirely. There's also visceral sensory receptors, and those largely are internal organs, and that's what we'll talk about there. And then there's a whole class of sensory receptors that I'll just talk about in passing. These sensory receptors are something that we won't even mention a mechanism by which this happens, and those come in smell, taste, vision, and hearing, and then you see there's also balance. Balance is associated with hearing and something area called the semicircular canals. If any of you have ever gotten seasick or car sick, that's a dysregulation of the semicircular canals associated with your ears. The special sensory receptors are not for this system at all, for this AMP1. For AMP2, the first unit that you'll do is there's smell, taste, vision, and hearing, balance and hearing. That's the first unit. And then there'll be other things associated with it too, depending on how the professor breaks that up. But the afferent division then has three major divisions. There's special sensory, visceral sensory, and somatic sensory. And that's also important. So when you're talking about divisions of the nervous system here, the nervous system I just mentioned, somatic sensory and visceral sensory, those are sort of mushing together. We're ignoring the special senses right now, and largely we're going to ignore them for this unit and for next unit. And then there's somatic motor and visceral motor. So somatic motor is going to send signals from the central nervous system to skeletal muscles and also glands. And visceral motor will send signals from the central nervous system to internal organs. And so internal organs are including anything in the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavity. And so there's a lot there. And we're going to just generally talk about the internal organs. We're not going to do any really specific things about them until we get to the autonomic nervous system. And that, again, we're going to tread lightly on those. Another term that I'll also use this term called effectors, and an effector is something that responds to a stimulus, and those effectors come in two varieties. Those are muscles and glands. Remember that we have three different types of muscles in the body. There's skeletal, smooth, and cardiac muscles, so there's a whole bunch of different muscles that are sent there, are receiving signals, and those signals that are being received are action potentials. So that term action potential we'll get later on in this week. We'll get into the details of an action potential, but that electrochemical signal is what is responding, the muscles or the glands respond to. Sensory receptors are sending signals in an afferent direction. All sensory signals send signals in this afferent direction. That means that it's transmitting action potentials from the receptors themselves to the central nervous system. We'll get into more of the somatic nervous system and the sensory receptors in Unit 5, but different types of internal and external stimuli largely are associated with modified or specialized epithelial cells. We've talked about epithelial tissue at great detail in Unit 1. These modified special epithelial tissue respond to internal and external pressure. They respond to a stimulus. That can be stretch, temperature, chemicals, or pain, and they send signals. They receive that signal, and if it is greater than a specific level that the neuron has, that's called threshold. If that threshold is exceeded, then it sends a signal on to the central nervous system. So it sends it along nerves to the brain or the spinal cord, and then what does the brain or spinal cord do? Well, the brain or the spinal cord has two options. Respond to it through the efferent system or ignore it. And you don't know exactly what's going to happen unless it's an absolute emergency. Right? So if it's an absolute emergency, then you can sort of classify a classic response. Assuming that the response is from these modified epithelial cells, they're being responded to, again, those are just going to be efferent or effector cells that are responding, and those include muscles and glands. The somatic nervous system largely is called the voluntary nervous system, and it's not entirely. There's definitely an autonomic component to it. There's an involuntary component to it, but we're going to call it just the voluntary nervous system. And again, that's just worried about going signals from the central nervous system to the skeletal muscles. In contrast, the autonomic nervous system is very different. It has largely subconscious or involuntary control. And it has different types of structures there. The sympathetic division is set up for one response. The parasympathetic division is set up for a different response. Those are the fight or flight or rest and digest. And then there's also the enteric nervous system, which combine a series of neurons that are associated with the walls of the digestive tract and the thoracic cavity that are really, really complex. And those are a series of plexuses within the walls of these systems here, largely the abdominal pelvic region and the thoracic region. And those combine with both motor and sensory signals that send signals to the central nervous system. All right, so if you just sort of think back, let's just take a break for a second here. The vocabulary that I just used is pretty substantial. I've repeated myself a few times, and hopefully the repeating of it means that it's important. If you are underwater right now and you're saying, oh my God, what the hell is he saying? Right? This is really, really basic nervous system terminology. And so where is this nervous system terminology going to be listed? It's going to be listed in Bio 220 in the vocabulary list. And I will be talking about this and this type of this vocabulary throughout this unit. And then we'll continue on with Unit 5 as well. By the way, unlike the other units, the overlap between Units 4 and 5, you might not be surprised by this, but the overlap is significant. So there's much, much more overlap between Unit 4 and Unit 5 than there is in any other two units, and that makes sense, I hope. So any questions for what we've just talked about? The basics of the nervous system. So now we'll talk about the cells of the nervous system, and they come in two varieties. They're neurons and neuroglia. And if you look at this slide right here, this slide just talks about the basics of the neurons. Right? So if you're talking about basics of the neurons, then we're talking about what we did last week in those diagrams. And the diagrams that I had, by the way, there were three neurons that were set up. One was an afferent neuron, one was an efferent neuron, and the third was an integrating neuron. That integrating neuron was largely a neuron that would be found in either the brain or the spinal cord. The afferent neuron is a neuron that would be a sensory neuron, and the third one was a motor neuron. So when you're talking about neurons themselves, they respond or send signals via electrical activity. These excitable cells there have some classic parts there. There's the neuron itself, or the main part of it, the cell body or the soma. And that's the major part of the cell. And then there's two different types of cellular extensions. When you can classify the cellular extensions by just visually seeing them, it's one type of neuron, and when you can't classify them, it's another type of neuron. So in other words, when you see the difference between these extensions, then it's one type of neuron. When you can't see the difference between those extensions, it's another type. What are the extensions? There's dendrites and axons. A dendrite is, or dendrites, are very, very numerous. They're short, and they're receptor versions of the neuron. These receptors they can conduct signals towards the cell body or the soma. They never send signals in the opposite direction. There are conditions under which signals or information does go very, very slowly in the opposite direction, and we'll talk about that later on today. But for right now, there's immediate response. If dendrites send signals, they send it in only one direction, send it from the dendrite to the cell body, and then the cell body will collect that information and then choose to send it on if it's strong enough or not. The action potential begins at a particular area in the axon called the axon hillock, and that's just directly adjacent to the cell body. And the axon hillock here is the initial segment of the axon. That's where the action potential begins. There are two terms that are associated with the axon themselves, either the axoplasm and the axolemma. The axolemma is the cell membrane of the axon, and that cell membrane is a specialized membrane that is highly reactive to the main thing that we're talking about here is a sodium-potassium pump. Sodium-potassium pump was one that we talked about way, way, way back in Unit 1, and I said to you back then, and I know you guys all remember this, I said, and that's a joke, I said that we're going to talk about it extensively, that sodium-potassium pump. It's going to come back again to haunt us again and again and again. And by the way, it's also going to haunt you in AMP too. When you are talking about axons themselves, these generate action potentials, and you're sending signals beginning from directly adjacent to the soma or the cell body. At the axon hillock, it sends down the axon to the terminal, or not to the terminal axon, to I forgot the term, but I'll get to it. I know but going ultimately down the terminal axon, and that terminal axon then is called the presynaptic axon or the presynaptic axon terminal. That presynaptic term there means that it's prior to the synapse, and a synapse is when any two cells get really, really close together and don't touch. We've already talked about an example of a synapse at a neuromuscular junction. So that example of a synapse here is continuing on. There, now that presynaptic terminal or that presynaptic axon, there is the area in which there's lots of mitochondria that occur, and then there's also synaptic vesicles. And the synaptic vesicles that contain what do they contain? They contain neurotransmitters. So this is a basic of the nervous system. If you look on the left-hand side, here's more or less a drawing of what I drew in the last week. The one thing that I will tell you is that where my pointer is, I said that there's only a single axon in all neurons, and here's the first slide picture here. There's two axons right here. So there's definitely some variation here, but we're going to say that for largely all neurons, and particularly what's called multipolar neurons have a single axon. If you look on the left-hand side, there's a drawing. On the right-hand side is a picture, photomicrograph. And then in the lower right-hand corner here, I talked about the synapse here of a neuromuscular junction. So this is a skeletal muscle cell here, and there's the axon terminal here, and that's the neuromuscular junction. That's a definition of a synapse. Now, if you look up here in the top right here, you can see some difference between the neurons themselves and the cell extensions. First of all, this, where my pointer is a cell extension. That's a cell extension. That's a cell extension, and that's a cell extension. So the term extension simply means a blob or a piece of cytoplasm that's coming off of the cell. And in this case, I'm pointing at, I could easily expect you to recognize this pointer pointing to a dendrite. Now, if you look right here, this is pointing to a dendrite. This is pointing to the soma or the cell body. By the way, I haven't mentioned, I don't think, but the nucleus is right here. And then the nucleolus is drawn in this picture right here. So the nucleus and the nucleolus is very, very prominent. I would probably not expect that you to distinguish between large dendrites. Dendrites will come in a variety of sizes here. I definitely could expect you to say this was an axon. If this is the axon, then this is the axon hillock, and this is where the action potential begins. So the signal is going to be sent the way that this in this slide is drawn here. The signal, the action potential is going to start here at the axon hillock. It's going to be sent down and to the right in this direction. Now, the axon is an incredibly important part of the cell, and it's a very small part of the cell. And the cell metabolism, the cell building of stuff, everything that is needed by the axon terminal and the axon itself is built in the cell, in the soma or the cell body. So what happens is that whatever is built there is then gets sent down the cell body, and it's called axonal transport. Axonic transport is the same thing. I think I call it axonal transport in next slides here. But what happens here is these cytoskeletal elements, these things that are found within the site of the axon, are shipped down the axon, and that's called axonal transport, and that's called anterograde transport. Anterograde transport means it's going from the soma down the axon to the axon terminal, towards the synapse, or the presynaptic bulb. That's normal sort of cell transport that occurs in a normal, a typical neuron that is functioning normally. There's also retrograde transport, or transport in the opposite direction. This opposite direction is sometimes it can be help with recycling things like damaged mitochondria, other damaged organelles, and other things. But it can also be an example of chronic or diseases here, either herpes virus or rabies. And what happens there is that those viruses will enter in the axons. They will then, via retrograde transport, go back up into the cell body and then continue on their journey and slowly but surely be incorporated into the neurons themselves. In the case of rabies, if you're infected and you don't, there's a very close window here, a very tight window. If you don't get the vaccine or the treatment from if you get bit by an animal with rabies, then the mortality rate, does anyone know what mortality rate for rabies is if you don't get treated appropriately?
100%.
100%. All right, so it's sort of a problem. So there's retrograde and anterograde transport. The one thing I want to be really, really stress is that the speed at which these transport mechanisms happen is infinitesimally small. It's incredibly slow. Right? It is so, and especially in contrast to, or in comparison to the speed of an action potential. So action potentials happen in the scale of what would be equivalent to be 150 miles an hour, some action potentials, and this type of transport is a snail's pace equivalent. So I talked about the different types of neurons I mentioned a minute ago. If you look at the different types of neurons, if you can distinguish between the axon and a dendrite, then you know it's one type of neuron, and if you can't, then it's another type of neuron. In this slide, we have different groups of different ways of organizing neurons. At the top, we have functional classification, and we talked about those already. And at the bottom is structural classification. So the functional classification is motor or efferent, sensory or afferent, and then the interneurons or integrating neurons. Those are all the same thing. Sending signals, it basically is sending what direction is the signal being sent within this central nervous system to or from the central nervous system. If you can easily identify multiple small extensions from the neuron and the cell body or the soma, and a single large axonal extension, then that by definition is called a multipolar neuron. Multipolar neurons are the most common, most abundant, and they're the ones that I'll be talking about. Anaxonic neurons are their opposites. They're the ones that have lots of branches, but you can't distinguish between the structure of a dendrite and the structure of an axon. It says here, I just saw this morning, it says that there's no axons here, there's only dendrites. First of all, there has to be an axon somewhere because the neuron has to send signals out from it. So this is really a misprint. It doesn't look like there's any axons. You can't tell what the axon looked from a simple slide projection. You can't tell that's an axon and that's a dendrite from anaxonic neurons. But I want to stress that all neurons have axons because all neurons send signals via the axon to the next synapse.
So would you just say for anaxonic, just few axons, or like maybe one?
No. There's definitely at least one axon, but you just can't tell the different which one from a slide. You can't identify it structurally because the axons look the same as the dendrites. Right? But there's definitely at least one axon. And then there's also two other neurons there. There's bipolar, and then the term I think in my questions will be unipolar. This book is calling it pseudo-unipolar, but unipolar and bipolar are also different ways of organizing it. These unipolar and bipolar are ways of organizing things so that they send signals very rapidly and they bypass the cell body or the soma. And so I'll show you pictures of those. So on the left-hand side, we have a multipolar neuron. On the right-hand side, an anaxonic neuron. There's a bipolar neuron and a pseudo-unipolar or a unipolar neuron. I'll use those terms, pseudo-unipolar and unipolar, synonymously. They're the same thing. In this case, regardless of whether we're talking about multipolar or anaxonic, bipolar or unipolar, there's going to be dendrites here. There's definitely going to be dendrites. There's dendrites here. If you can't identify the dendrites and distinguish them between the dendrites and axons, then it is what this neuron will be like here. This anaxonic neuron is entirely located within the central nervous system, and it's designed to send signals short distances. In lab this week, I talked about, or last week rather, we talked about the structure of white matter and where white matter is found within the spinal cord and where gray matter is found within the spinal cord. So you would find neurons like this, these anaxonic neurons like this, found entirely within the central nervous system, like for instance in the brain or the spinal cord in the gray matter. So this neuron right here, by definition, can't have any myelin. It doesn't have any myelin. These neurons right here that are on the to the left right here, these axons might have myelin depending on where they are in the body. Generally speaking, this multipolar neuron, which largely goes to skeletal muscles, 100% of those multipolar neurons will have myelin. Let me just back up one thing here. I don't think that I mentioned, there's a couple of terms in the cells themselves, in the cell body themselves, that I don't think that I mentioned here. So, and I just want to go back to this because I'm going to transition away from neurons and go to neuroglia in a minute. So first of all, this picture right here in this drawing on the left-hand side, we're just talking about the cell body or the soma. And the cell body or the soma has a couple of things, including the nucleus and the nucleolus. I pointed that out. But it has a very, very extensive Golgi apparatus and a very, very extensive rough endoplasmic reticulum and smooth endoplasmic reticulum. I don't think the term chromatophilic substances are used in this book, but Nissl bodies are, N-I-S-S-L bodies, B-O-D-I-E-S. Nissl bodies are modified endoplasmic reticulum that are very, very extensive, and they're so extensive that makes the cell body itself look very dark. And if you look right here on the right-hand side, The reason why this cell body is so dark is, again, because of those modified endoplasmic reticulum. The Nissl bodies, then what do? They do classically what any endoplasmic reticulum does, and it ships it when it's needed via the Golgi apparatus or Golgi bodies. Those things encapsulate particular things. And what are we talking about here? We're talking about any type of cytoskeletal elements, and we'll talk about where those are in a minute. Internal cytoskeletal elements, that's one thing. Second thing is neurotransmitters and synaptic vesicles. Those things are all assembled within the soma or the cell body, and they're shipped down via axonal transport in an anterograde direction. They're sent down here in the case of the cytoskeletal elements. Again, that's something else that we talked about in unit 1. The cytoskeletal elements, there's a bunch of them that are found within the axon itself. Those are built in by the Nissl bodies. And then the synaptic vesicles, which themselves are also built by the Nissl bodies and then encapsulated by the Golgi apparatus, they're sent down to, in this drawing right here on the left-hand side, down to the axon terminal. Another thing that we'll talk about, and I'm going to start talking about in a minute here, is the structure of the additional neuronal cells, or nervous system cells, not neuronal cells. So where my pointer is right now in this diagram, we have the axon hillock, and this is the initial center of the axon. Then we have this part right here, the myelin, and that myelin is a different type of cell. And then we have a space right there, and another space, and a third space, and a fourth space. So there's multiple spaces on each of these axons, and those spaces are called nodes of Ranvier, and those are important because those nodes are where the action potentials happen. And I talked about different types of action potentials last week. I've talked about slow action potentials and fast action potentials. A slow action potential would be me walking across the stage or across the room, putting one foot in front of the other in a very, very slow and methodical way. That's the analogous to what action potential is by gray matter. It doesn't have to travel very long distances, and so it sends it in one direction or another, but there's no myelin, or there's no other neuroglia that are helping that signal. In this case, this drawing right here is a multipolar neuron, where if I'm sending signals and I'm jumping from one, and I'm taking very, very large steps, I'm moving a lot faster here. That's called saltatory movement here, so it moves from here to here to here to here, and so on. That movement, that saltatory movement of an action potential occurs very, very rapidly, and it can move over very long distances too. Those nodes of Ranvier are important points or acts of the axon or the axal lemma, and that's where the sodium-potassium pump occurs dramatically. All right, so I think I'm done talking about the neurons then. And we talked about the structure of the neurons, the shape of the neurons, and otherwise, when we're talking about the shape of the neurons, this is not really affecting whether or not what they do, right? The neurons do what neurons do, and that is send action potentials. Right? That's all they do, and they do it really, really fast. Even the slow ones do it really fast. So what I want to do now is let's take a break here, and then I think what I'm going to do is stop after we talk about glial cells for today. So I'm going to take a break right now. Let's see here. It is almost 9:24. So how about if you take 10 minutes, 9:35, and come back at 9:35.